My name is Jamal Binder, and welcome to Community Conversations with More. This is one of those programs that we do to bring people into the circle to talk about racial and ethnic disparities and issues in our community and in our society. We have today with us Emma Monahan. She does research dealing with social scientists. I had a chance to read her blog that she wrote for our More webpage. And I invited her to talk about the implications of the article, as well as some of her experience of being a white woman and being woke. That's a big concept now that everybody's talking about. And there are many books and articles of dealing with those issues of anti-racism and race issues and woke, and you name it. Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, got a lot of play out of that. And she recently just came with another book called Nice Racism. And one of my colleagues picked that book up and is reading it and enjoying it. And so, again, this is in the vein of that. And nice racism basically defines white liberals who go up to the wall and stop at a certain point and don't do more. Others are writing about race issues since the brutal murder of George Floyd and other victims of American democracy. So I wanted to get some observations from Emma about what's going on from her perspective, and just kind of have a general conversation that can help increase the dialogue about some of the interracial issues in our society. So Emma, welcome to Community Conversation with More.
Thank you, Rajamal. Thank you for having me.
Good. First, tell the listening audience or viewing audience a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Emma. I currently live in Chicago, Illinois, but I grew up in Indiana and have lived in Michigan and Wisconsin. So I'm a pretty strong Midwest girl. I grew up in Southern Indiana, which was a rural community. So that's kind of the type of community I was raised in. I got my PhD in social welfare. So I'm a social policy researcher, and I am trying very hard with my career to research social policy, understand how we can make our social safety net better and our policies and programs better for families.
First, let's start with your blog. You in your blog, you talk about your experience of dealing with racial issues, and also my question to you: what was your most defining moment in understanding that concept of white privilege, or racialized issues in our society? Give us a little bit more insight into that. Your aha moment, as we would say.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for me to pin down one aha moment, especially, I think every time that I think maybe, oh, I feel like I've probably learned everything, or I think I kind of get it now. I will either say something that is wrong, I will do unintentional harm to someone through my actions or my words, or I'll read something new, right, that just totally changes the way I see things and helps me learn even more outside of my white-centered narrative. So I think it's a continual process always. But I will say that things that really always stick out to me the most and stick with me are whenever I have said something or done something that has harmed a person of color in some way. Either it was cultural, what I said was appropriating their culture, or had some unintended consequence, right? And I think those have always been teaching moments for me. So they've been with people who we had enough respect that they could tell me what I had said was wrong or offensive. And so that, I at first, right, it makes me feel really guilty. I feel really bad. And then I've learned that that is the white guilt getting in the way of being able to just learn from that and move on and have that conversation. And so, there are a few times that have happened that always stick with me, and I have learned from that. But I think those are constant reminders for me of my privilege, because I don't have to think about that. And if I had been in an all white space, no one would have ever said anything. Mm-hmm. Right. And that I can, I will never be perfect. And so trying to, if I can, that's always what I say is I just want to get to a point where I am seen as an ally, and I don't, I can be in spaces and not say things that unintentionally harm folk. Because
a white colleague once told me that most whites consider race or diversity work when they read an article or participate in a book discussion on the racial subject. Why is the bar set so low for white folks? Again, I just heard you use the word ally, and I don't know what that really means. But can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question about the word ally. And I know there's been a lot of pushback on that term too, right? And so I think I guess that's true that maybe I don't know exactly what I want to be, but I do know that I would like to be able to be continue to have conversations and be and work with people who aren't just like me, right? And in terms of why do we have to read something or have some kind of experience that makes us feel bad to learn and move forward and kind of understand that racism exists? I think it's just because this world is designed for us, right? We live in a world where our narrative is the norm. And so we don't have to think about it unless we're forced to.
Mhm.
And that's just the way it is set up. And so that's not helpful, I don't think, for anyone. But it does turn into this. And I've, heard this from a lot of friends of color too, is how exhausting it is to constantly educate us, right? And that they don't want to be the ones to have to tell us about our privilege and that we should be recognizing it. And so I think that's something that we should all be trying to do more of. But it is true that if we are always surrounded by white people, for example, it's really hard to see your privilege or understand where your power is.
Right.
Um, yeah.
The other thing that brings to mind is I was on Facebook and a guy asked a question, can somebody tell about Malcolm X? And I responded like, that's kind of a strange question. I was like saying, can somebody tell about Martin Luther King? You should know that. And somebody pushed back at me and said, we all start someplace. And I had to kind of push back a little bit and think, okay, there's a point there. But sometimes we got to do a little bit of homework before we get into the conversations with adults or people who are in the struggle. Because again, when you're busy running forward and doing what you got to do, you don't have time to make baby steps when you're in the middle of battle dealing with the hardcore racists that we deal with in our society. In Omaha, we have colonialist organizations called, I'm gonna use the word Omaha Land Bank. I contacted the director at least 3 or 4 times, no response. I'm going to meet with you there. And again, I've seen how they operate, where they go and do certain things. And I'm calling them out because I have examples of working with folks like that. Basically, they ignore you. And again, it illustrates to me a form of racism, especially dealing with race issues. But really, she's not going to address the merits of dealing with their apartheid behavior in this land bank. It was set up like that. And I'm using that as an example. What does it take to help folks to avoid the cancel culture that apparently folks in white fragility personalities do? In other words, as white folks, there's an opportunity that people just ignore or they don't respond because they don't have to. And people who are at the bottom are oppressed, racialized group don't have the power to affect their livelihood. So my question in a sense is, how can we address some of that kind of behavior that is obvious what's happening?
Yeah. And how can we force the conversations, right? Or maybe not even force, but get people to want to have the conversations, right? I thought about this question for a while and I don't think I have a great answer or this, perfect solution. But I think it happens because especially in our society, we are also concerned about ourselves, right? People are always worried about saving their own image or what is this going to mean for me or how is me having this conversation going to affect my job or my profession. And you know, for a long time, I have thought that that is one of the biggest downfalls of especially the individualistic society that we live in, is that we do not think outside of ourselves and we're always making decisions based on what's best for ourselves. And so I think for people to really be willing to enter into conversations like that, that will be difficult and will be hard, and you probably will say something wrong. They aren't willing to take that risk. And it's hard for me to do too, right? I get nervous and it's a constant, it's kind of something you have to train and practice a little bit, right? To just be comfortable with the uncomfortable
Right.
and be okay with disagreements. I think especially in my field in social work, we don't like to disagree. I do not like conflict. I am a big people pleaser, and so I think it's having to learn that that's not always the best way to grow or to learn. And so, I think a little bit more selflessness and not being so centered on ourselves would help. I have no good solution for how to promote that within people.
Well, something came in as you were talking, and I thought of him is Heath Mello comes to mind. He's an administrator making a double six-figure salary in university administration. I wrote him a letter. He ended up writing me back an email saying, "Let's get together." Never, I wrote him back and never followed up. And I shared this with another white colleague, and he says, "Oh, Jamal, all the letters and notes that you write, what you should do is just start putting them on Twitter." And you would embarrass, the
Mhm.
director of CPAC who didn't follow up to do what he said he was going to do. And again, at the end of the day, there's no love lost. But these folks are working on the public till using public funds. It's not like I want to be their Facebook friend, but we just have to call them in and call them out. And you
Mhm.
give people one excuses. And then one example I said is I wrote to 12 school board members years ago, and I think only two wrote me back. One returned my letter with the stamp, and I had a self-enclosed stamped envelope for them to write me back. I'm all public schools, and only of the 12, only two wrote back. And I remember that well. And I went to a board meeting and talked about it, still talk about it. But I've written to some of the dark-skinned school board members, they never responded. And so what's the use of having district elections or having people in positions of power if they don't respond to constituents, particularly when they're elected or public officials living off
Mhm.
our fat of our taxes? I hate paying taxes for lazy people who don't reach back to help other people. So that's part of the conversation I would throw back out at our community. And if we don't hold them accountable, then we deserve what we get. Um, I noted that in many states, folks have become critical of critical race theory. That sounds weird. They become critical of critical race
I know it's
theories.
a double.
Uh, what does that mean to folks when they want to learn about genocide or historical enslavement of Africans and the immigration issues that many of the Asians or Latinos experience, or Chicanos, we would say some of us, that kept many people from coming to our country or coming to this country, and particularly in light of how we've treated Native Americans. So my question to you is, from your vantage point, talk to me a little about what you know of critical race theory and why is that such a flashpoint in our society from your vantage point?
So I am still confused, right, about why people have become critical of critical race theory. Um, I can remember I didn't learn about it until my last year of my undergraduate degree. And as someone who's studying social work, I couldn't believe that it had taken that long to learn about a theory that I mean, ideally for every course, right? But in a minor where we're talking about social policy issues and social inequalities, critical race theory should frame every conversation. I think people, I don't have much, I can't know for sure, but I assume, right? It's just white fragility and white guilt again, right? They don't want to keep hearing about critical race theory or about how we have to reshape all the ways we think to consider race and racism. And I think it's probably some semblance of people fighting back against that. But I my view of the world was fully transformed in college. I learned so much there about race and equity and racism and structural discrimination. And I think I'm so grateful that I had that opportunity. And I wish those types of conversations started in public school, right? Not everyone has a chance to go to college. And there is so much that the narrative is so narrow and so white-centered in public education, right? Particularly for our tribal history, African-American history. And so the amount that we could just expand those types of knowledge and things like critical race theory to everyone, right? That's really where, particularly for white people, I think some of that revolutionary learning can occur. Because if we don't hear it from a classroom and we're still living in our mostly white community, you're just never going to get that exposure.
Good. You know, I noticed in your blog article that you drafted, you discussed growing up and attending college with diverse racial groups. Was there any situation in particular that set you up in terms of your racial data development, meaning you became conscious as a white person? And the theory you talk about is hams and cross. They talk about how do you develop as a person of color as well as how do you develop as a white, and when you become woke or aware of racial issues. So my question is, was there some things that you developed, again, the fact you grew up in Southern Indiana, how did you evolve in your racial awareness and where you're at today?
Yeah, I think there were two distinct experiences I had in college that really helped form my understanding of racism and my own white privilege and power. One of them was a student group that I helped lead called Alternative Spring Break. But through that, we, a group of students from all grades and, all backgrounds, and people that you wouldn't often meet otherwise, right? We would take a week-long trip together. And leading up to that, we had multiple conversations about how you enter and exit a community with your identities, what it means to be an active citizen. And we talked a lot about racism and white privilege and in those preparation meetings. And then we were on a trip 24/7 with these people that we didn't know of all different races and ethnicities. And so conversations just had to be had. And it wasn't a 2-hour dialogue where you go in, you might feel uncomfortable, but you say something and then you walk away and never see them again. If you had a conversation, it was tough, you were going to be with that person for the next however long is on the trip, right? So you had to keep talking about it and working it out. And I think that was really foundational for me, to just build those friendships and lasting relationships through that experience. And then we also, where I went to school, they had a class called Intergroup Dialogue. And so it was a semester-long dialogue course, just particularly about race and white privilege. And there's 12 to 15 of us sitting in a circle and with a trained facilitator. And I think that was really also foundational. And so, I just think those experiences and that relationship building and those space to have those conversations were really critical.
Mhm. And when I had a conversation with a white female friend who told me how difficult it was to raise a white male child compared to what people of color teach their children. How do you talk to your child about race or racism or prejudice or any of those things? Or have you done that? I'm not sure of the age of your child, but how do you approach that, or can you?
Yeah, I think I'm always wondering this, and I would love to, so she's only 15 months. I have one daughter. She's 15 months, so she's not quite sentient enough to be talking about that. But we've bought a lot of books that have people of all different colors and ethnicities represented, and we have a couple that are explicitly about racism and kind of structural, they have lots of board books and stuff these days that try to bring up that kind of address a lot of these issues. And so that's kind of where we thought we would start with some of these books, right? And I think what we think about a lot, particularly as white parents, is that we think the best thing we can do is just expose her, to people of all different colors and ethnicities, to become friends and to get to know them, right? And so we value living in a community with that kind of diversity, because we can only teach so much as people who don't actually know what it's like.
By the way, there are a number of books out there for folks who want to raise the issue, because again, I have a number of friends and colleagues who are raising kids of different racial groups from their own. And so that could be somewhat taxing for them if they don't have a great understanding of some of the challenges that a young person will go through in our society. But it's very important not to ignore it. But then when this white person told me that, I think she was telling me from a point of view that she has to push back against the traditional racism that people embedded, or the privilege that they embed when they grow up, where they don't even acknowledge some of the social justice issues dealing with race in our society. So that's part of that conversation. Um, I'm working on a scale, and again, it's one of those long-term agendas that I've been working on, is how do you help develop identity where people are doing something about race? Again, I want to utilize a person that is awoke on different levels. And, it's one thing to talk about it from an Afrocentric or racialized point of view, but from a white point of view, how do you determine when somebody's moving on the scale to be anti-racist? So good, quick example for me is John Brown is one extreme, where I like John Brown because he fought against slavery and gave his life to get rid of slavery. And then you got the other extreme, the person who's kind of like a racist who just benefits, but he or she give a little lip service. So what I'm asking is, how do you develop a scale? And is there possible to develop a racialized scale of being awoke versus being blind? And again, from a white perspective, that's what I'm asking.
I mean, I think there would definitely be a way to develop a scale, right? If we're talking about in terms of like you would ask folks questions and they would answer and you could give them a level that they seem to be aware, right, of racial issues or their own privilege. I think what would be needed, right, is really thinking about, probably from my perspective or other, and you maybe through all these data and interviews that you're doing and collecting, like what are the key elements to achieving, right, racial awareness. And so I don't think I'm there, right? I think I'm always learning, and so I don't feel like I know all of the elements. But I think there's part of it that is being willing to have conversations, right? The person has to be moved past the white guilt phase. So even if they're aware, they know racism exists, they know that they hold power and privilege as a white person, but if they're so caught up in the guilt about that they can't talk about it or do anything about it, right? That feels like that's a step that needs to occur. And the other thing, right, is just acknowledging it, no longer trying to act like it doesn't exist or like, oh, maybe it's not that bad. But I'm not fully sure how you would measure that. So yeah, I think it's possible. I really like the idea. I'm sure we can maybe work on that more.
Well, you know what, Emma, as a researcher, someone has advanced college and university skill set and setting up research design, that might be something we can work on. But there was something else you just said that hit me, and then you've said it on more than one occasion. And I've asked this in community forums, and I don't always get a straight answer. I find that concept of white guilt. What does that mean? Can you explain when somebody says, I feel white guilt? I mean, I know I feel guilty when I ate some candy I shouldn't have eaten. I'm getting, it messes with my health or whatever. So my point back to you is, what do white people mean when they use the term white guilt? What do you do with that guilt? And can it be healthy? Is it good? What is white guilt?
So I think of it as like that guilty feeling I feel when I have done something that has harmed someone else because of my whiteness and my lack of knowing, right? So I alluded to these earlier, but I can be more concrete. I used to work in a state government in the child welfare department, and I was at a meeting, and it was with a lot of stakeholders, and our tribal partners were there. And during the break, I was just in a conversation with another coworker, and they were asking about me and my siblings, and I said something like, "Oh, I'm pretty low on the totem pole these days because my siblings have kids." And I had no idea that is, which now, right, I understand, of course, that's harmful, that's cultural appropriation, but the tribal partners in the room heard me, right? And we had to have a conversation about it. When they first told me, right, like, you can't say that, it was just like this horrible guilty feeling. And I think what really distinguishes is that I'm then only thinking about me. I'm not thinking about how they felt hearing me as a white person say that. I'm thinking about how terrible I feel now because I said something that hurt someone. And then I think it gets what I think can be bad about white guilt is then we get so caught up in how we're feeling and trying to make ourselves feel better that we can often say more bad things, trying to make ourselves feel better, or say, oh, I didn't mean it that way. It doesn't matter if I meant it that way, right? What matters is what the words did.
Right.
So that's how I think about it, is like
Very
that
good.
bad feeling that then focuses myself inward instead of thinking about.
Well, the reason why I think your explanation and what you shared is so important is because so often we don't have this bannered in our apartheid media. I mean, I can't begin to tell you the media and some of the silly stories that we see that never drills down into the well to deal with the substance or the truth to help us grow. And people tend to gloss over it or just say the superficial stupidity stuff that you see coming out of the drivel that they call media. It's almost like, you get all these commercials and things, it's like cliche. And so, again, if you mess up, you fess up, is that expression, or if you do something bad in your conscience and you deal with it. And even as we say, if you are speeding, the police officer, when that person pulls you aside, you can't say, I didn't know that. The ignorance of the law is no excuse. So again, there's just things we should know. And I find it somewhat challenging when I'm in the circle of some of these ignoramuses walking around, and they don't have a clue because they've allowed themselves to be socialized in an apartheid racist environment, and they get away with that crap. And when somebody calls them out on it, they want to start whining and defending it, when actual fact, they're just wrong. I mean, you can't ignore history, you can't ignore privilege, you can't ignore benefits that you get based on some attributes that you didn't do anything for, and so those are the conversations. Have you ever called someone or an institution a racist?
I laughed when I saw this question. I think, and then I was trying to think really hard. And I think my answer is I don't think so. And that is kind of what I said earlier, is that I am so non-confrontational. And that I've thought it many times, right? Or, I've had the broad conversations with friends or family about our society, right? And how our policies are racist and our housing discrimination, right? And as a whole, but I don't think, and I'm not sure I've ever called an individual racist to their face. And that's something I really need to work on, because there's been things that I've heard said that are just wrong. And I should have called people out on it, right? Especially where I'm from. Growing up, and even now when I go back home, like, people say awful things sometimes, just very ignorant things.
Well, have they said the N word in front of you?
No,
Okay.
no. Most of the things they say are homophobic, and just, but like just very mean white centered things. And I often think I should say something, and I know I should.
Well, I had to cut a couple of my white friends off. I mean, I used to have 7 out down to 4, but they would come to me all the time and tell me what they should have did. I'm like, hold it, I've given you 3 strikes, you're out. But at some point, you can't expect me to be doing all the heavy lifting and as they say, carry out the dream to make the thing the transformation. But again, there's systems and institutions where people only say things in their group. And if we're serious about having a society that's much more equal and egalitarian and fair, that means we have to call systems institutions out when everybody get the jobs because they know somebody, or they are related to someone, or they belong to the same dogmatic cult, or whatever you want to call them, and they just operate like that. The other thing is, I
Add it to
actually
the
asked.
scale, Jamal.
What'd you
Add it
say?
to the scale. Add it to our woke scale.
There we go. There we go.
I have to hit that one.
I actually was talking to a person of color, particularly African American. I asked this person if they would call somebody racist or an institution. They said no. I almost fell on the floor. I thought that was like being Black or being African American or being African, that at some point you're going to call someone out. This person said never. And I was shocked. And also years ago, I interviewed a guy who was a photographer, and I asked him, has he ever engaged or dealt with people who were poor? And he said he didn't know any. And again, I was surprised. I mean, again, it was his worldview. I couldn't take away from him, but that's what he shared. And I wasn't going to challenge him because that's his world. But I just found it amazing that an African American growing up in a city like Indianapolis, that's where this person is from, I'm not calling their name out today, which I could, said that he's never encountered poor people or low income people, I assume somehow, whatever. But yeah, it was just amazing to hear that. By the way, I know Southern Indiana is different from Northern Indiana. I've heard that from people who are from Indiana, and they describe Southern Indiana as kind of like, and I've heard people use the word like hillbilly or rural or whatever. It's different from the North, where you got the university or something like that, much sophisticated. Is it really that kind of a dichotomy? I've only been to Indianapolis, going through and in a city like Elkhorn one time years ago, but what is Indiana like, the picture book or whatever like that?
Yeah, it is quite different. And so I mean, and I have not spent much time in Northern Indiana, nor do I know many people from there. So I don't, but from my understanding, and the few times I've been to places like Lafayette and South Bend and Fort Wayne, right, it's very industrial up there. It's right, Purdue is there, Notre Dame is there. So it's definitely different. Southern Indiana is rural. Yeah, there's lots of, I'm just over the border from Kentucky. So it's pretty, I would say we're more similar to Kentucky than we are to Northern Indiana.
Okay. All right. Okay. Emma, good. Thanks for sharing that. Emma, we're getting close to the end, but I wanted to, you spoke in your article about living in a community where you and your spouse are in the minority. What does that really mean? Now, you and I didn't really talk about that, but what does that mean when you say you and your spouse live in a community where you are the minority?
Yeah, so we live in a neighborhood. It's called Hyde Park, so it's on the south side of Chicago. And don't get me wrong, Hyde Park is where University of Chicago is, right? So if you even go like a mile in a different direction from us, you are then in a majority white neighborhood with lots of people from the university and lots of university students. But the neighborhood that we live in specifically, the largest demographic is Black families. So it's the first time I've ever lived anywhere where white people are not the majority, right? And every day when I am walking on the sidewalk, I see mostly Black people, right? So, and it is, it was a huge it was like, I'll never forget moving in here, and me coming in thinking I was woke, right? I mean, just I know, like, oh, I'm not racist. I'm pretty much over all my implicit biases, yada yada. And we moved in here to a place that is majority Black, which I've never lived in or spent a ton of time in before, right? And I was nervous, or I didn't know. I was wondering about safety for no reason at all, and it was bringing up all of these stereotypes. And I felt that white guilt, right? And then I was only, it was something I really had to reckon with. And I think it took only a few days to be like, everyone here is so nice, right? Like, I was being ridiculous. And I think it's really taught me the importance of exposure to really get over our implicit biases and our stereotypes, right? And I can't remember the TED Talk, but I listened to one once where she was talking about how to overcome your implicit biases. And one of them just was like, being around Black people, for example, or being around these groups that you have these biases, because otherwise they do clearly stick back there, right? Doesn't matter how much you read or how many podcasts I listen to. Like, it wasn't until I've just been in a community that is not majority white, for me to really deal with those. And I'm sure there's still some back there, right? But I do think I've been able to reckon with a lot of them. And it's been a great experience. So yeah, I think that's what I meant. And definitely a defining experience for me.
Yeah. Emma Monahan, we're down to our last question. I always say to folks, do you have any closing comments or anything you'd like to share with our audience? You alluded to your PhD, and I know you have a master's in social work, and you've done a lot of research and readings related to a lot of issues that impact us, that impacts us as a society. But are there some things you'd like to share with our viewing audience before we end this recording?
Only that I am so grateful to have had this conversation and to have met you, Ajmal. I've already learned so much through our working together, and that I welcome all feedback, all critiques, and I'm always wanting more resources or anything to learn, right? So if anyone sees this and wants to talk further, I'm more than happy to do that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you appearing today on the Community Conversations with more, and we will hopefully bring more opportunities to talk to people who contribute to our blog, but also people who can help enlighten us as well as drill down in some of these issues that we oftentimes don't hear in our popular media that doesn't cover race in an adequate manner. So thank you for being here today, and hopefully get a chance to do this again.
Thanks, Ajmal.
Yeah. Hope you enjoyed this edition. Barocco.